raised with strict religious beliefs, accused of murdering their own family.
They were dead set on killing their parents. They would talk about it every time I saw them.
The grim discovery of a triple murder that was so appalling, the identity of the suspects, that was even more alarming.
I'd say there was a lot of rage, certainly very brutal.
And what could drive two sons to such a diabolical act?
The world is a cruel place. We've heard that ever since we were young. But what's more brutal than kids murdering their own parents in cold blood? Not one of them, but three of them. Such stories always send chills down our spines and make us freeze in between our tracks for a second. I'm sure you've heard the story of the Freeman brothers, but if you haven't, here it is. On February 26, 1995, the Freeman family was murdered in Salisbury Township, Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. Brian Freeman, then 17, and his brother, 16-year-old David Freeman, as well as their cousin, 18-year-old Nelson Ben Birdwell III, murdered their parents, Brenda and Dennis, as well as Eric, their 11-year-old younger brother, at their family home.
What turned these little boys into these frightening young men? Tom Jarrell investigates their chilling journey. Going berserk.
The brothers had been enjoying a neo-Nazi lifestyle for several years, which had grown in the months leading up to the killings, including tattooing Nazi inscriptions on their foreheads.
An act of violence that turned the spotlight on the bizarre hate group they joined.
Tattoos all over their body and on their foreheads and swastikas on them and everything.
Both brothers and their cousin were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, even though none of the three were convicted of Eric Freeman's murder.
And the weapon teachers fear most.
Last week, some fourth graders said their teacher molested them.
More and more teachers charged with abuse.
Despite a previous Supreme Court ruling that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles guilty of murder were unconstitutional, the sentences were upheld in 2014.
Plane landed in central Pennsylvania. Aboard, three of the most wanted fugitives in the nation, brought home to face the consequences of a crime which has stunned and baffled the peaceful community of Salisbury Township.
Dennis and Brenda Freeman lived in Pennsylvania's Salisbury Township. Dennis was a janitor at a nearby high school. Brian, David, and Eric were the first three sons he and his wife Brenda had. They were a pious family that raised their sons as Jehovah's Witnesses. Brian and David despised their family life and became involved in neo-Nazism.
Never had a murder that was this horrific before in this area at all, in Salisbury Township.
It was especially shocking because until a few years ago, the Freemans seemed like the typical family next door.
Brenda's friends reported that she was terrified of her elder sons. Brian and David shaved their hair, dressed in military outfits, and became involved in a neo-Nazi subculture. Brian got Berserker tattooed across his forehead, and David had the words Sieg Heil tattooed above his brows. Brenda allegedly contacted counselors and psychologists for advice.
His wife, Brenda, was devoted to their three sons, Brian, David, and 11-year-old Eric. They followed the rigid, disciplined beliefs of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
She persuaded Brian and David to attend police-led anti-skinhead education courses, but her efforts to keep them away from neo-Nazism finally failed. Brian had been hospitalized for mental illness, and David had been placed in many juvenile facilities, as well as having substance abuse therapy.
Tom Bamonte, a congregation elder, knew the Freemans for the past 20 years.
They wanted their children to grow up to have good Christian standards and good values.
Salisbury police said they had visited the Freeman home 5 times between 1993 and 1995. In an argument over using the family automobile, Brian allegedly threatened to kill his parents. Brian had been expelled from Salisbury High School after he drew racist images in a book.
As Brian and David became teenagers, a friend, Tim Peters, saw rebellion setting in.
Around 9th grade, it seemed that they were getting more away from the Jehovah religion. They wanted more freedom. They didn't want to be Jehovah Witness anymore.
Brian Freeman, 17, David Freeman, 16, and their cousin, 18-year-old Ben Birdwell, arrived at the Freeman family home on February 26, 1995. They had been to the movies and had returned to their family's home on Eretz Lane.
Eric's death. He was just 11 and not part of the family conflict.
Brenda Freeman, 48, argued with Brian and David about Birdwell being in the house. Brian grabbed Brenda and forced a pair of shorts into her mouth as she came down the stairs. He then repeatedly stabbed her to death with a steak knife he had gotten from the kitchen.
How could they have killed Eric?
I think perhaps he received a little bit better treatment, naturally being obedient.
David and Birdwell then proceeded upstairs to Dennis Freeman's bedroom, where he was sleeping. They then murdered Dennis with a metal exercise bar and an aluminium baseball bat. Eric, 11, was fast asleep in his bed. One or more of the assailants beat him repeatedly with a 3-foot pickaxe handle until he died. The trio departed in Brenda's 1988 Pontiac convertible automobile, loaded with a 12-gauge shotgun.
And then I think perhaps the other thing would be that they didn't want to leave anybody behind.
Brian, David, and their cousin took a family automobile from the garage and drove away into the night.
Dennis's sister, Valerie Freeman, discovered the Freemans' body in their house the day after they were murdered. Coroners in Allentown reported the murders as one of the most heinous they had ever witnessed.
It was a perfect location for the three young men to get away, to hide away from the pressures of their hometown in Pennsylvania.
The murders were also described as savage by Lehigh County District Attorney Bob Steinberg, who claimed Dennis and Eric's faces had been pummeled and bludgeoned so terribly that they were practically unrecognizable. The Freeman brothers and Birdwell escaped to Hope, Michigan, to the house of skinhead associate Frank Hess. Hess and the Freeman brothers had met at a New Year's Eve concert and exchanged phone numbers. 3 days after the murders, they were apprehended and detained at their house.
Even under extremely tight security, in handcuffs and leg irons, the three teenagers still seemed large and menacing. It's an appearance they carefully cultivated.
Brian pleaded guilty to Brenda's murder to avoid the death penalty, while David pleaded guilty to Dennis' murder. Birdwell was tried for all 3 killings and convicted of Dennis Freeman's murder when DNA testing matched blood on his t-shirt to Dennis's.
Just 48 hours after the crime in which they are charged had occurred, the Freemans and their cousin were socializing 550 miles away. They crashed at the half-built house of Frank Hess, sharing stories before a big swastika.
Eric's murderer was never found guilty. Brian admitted that the murders were motivated by years of hostility between the brothers and their parents. The death penalty was avoided for all 3 defendants, but they were all condemned to life in jail without the possibility of parole.
16-year-old David Freeman. He too faces charges of murdering his mother, his father, and 11-year-old brother Eric.
The men are currently being held at the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Brian is incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution. Birdwell is incarcerated at State Correctional Institution.
The suspected leader of the pack, 17-year-old Brian Freeman, was formally arraigned on triple murder charges. He was followed in the procession by his cousin, 18-year-old Nelson Birdwell, charged with helping in their escape to Michigan.
The 3 perpetrators of the crime were identified as Brian Robert Freeman, David Jonathan Freeman, and Nelson Benjamin Ben Birdwell III. All 3 identified as neo-Nazis, but they were not affiliated with any neo-Nazi organization. Prior to the murders, the trio allegedly planned to start their own neo-Nazi group. Valerie Freeman had observed a shift in Brian and David's demeanor. Her nephews had become stubborn and belligerent, according to her.
The whole community of Salisbury Township has not put the episode behind them. Nagging worries remain. How safe is our community? How safe is our home?
On the 20th anniversary of the killings, the Freeman brothers expressed regret and remorse for their actions. Brian Freeman issued a statement in which he admitted to committing a heinous crime and stated that he deserved to be punished. "If you bring up what happened, they cry," said Lettig, who visits the brothers frequently. Why do you think any person would commit a crime so heinous? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to click on that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel before you leave.